Welcome back. Today is lesson 4-6, square roots and cube roots. Again, you're going to get to use your calculator for this lesson. I will probably teach you a little bit more tomorrow how to use your calculator and how to do square roots on it and cube roots on it. So for the most part, just kind of get written down what I talk about, and then tomorrow we'll talk more about your calculator. All right, so a square root is when you take a number, and I just called it n, so it can be any number. When you take a number and you multiply it by itself. Okay, so like if you take 3 times 3, okay, so if you take 3 times 3, 9. 9 would be a perfect square, and then the n, so or like the 3 would be the square root. So the square root is what the number is that you're multiplying by itself. A perfect square is when the square root is a whole number. So I'll talk about that in a little bit, but here's an example down below. 64 is a perfect square because we know the square root of 64 is 8. 8 times 8 is 64. There's only very few perfect squares. Now let's just make a list. I'm going to make a list with you of the perfect squares. Well, 1 is not considered a perfect, I mean, 1 is a special number because 1 times 1 is itself. So that's a little bit of a special number. But in other words, like 2 times 2, 4 would be a perfect square. 9's a perfect square. 16's a perfect square because I take 2 times 2 to get 4, 3 times 3 to get 9, 4 times 4 to get 16. 25 would be a perfect square. 36 is a perfect square. 49 is a perfect square. Um, 64, wait, is that right? Yep, 64, 81. Another perfect square would be 100. Let's see, 11 times 11, I'm not even 100% sure. I think 121. 121. I think 12 times 12 is 144. And really, I think 169 is 13 times 13. Really, you technically don't need to memorize all these because, like I said, there's very few perfect squares. And you probably know all the perfect squares like I just did up to 12. Probably not necessary for you to know, I mean, up to 13, I think I went to like 14, 15, 16. But knowing some of the perfect squares is definitely beneficial, especially to what we're going to be talking about today. So, another vocabulary word I have for you is radical, okay, or the square root symbol. This is the symbol for a square root. So, if they want you to find a square root, so like this says up here, square root of 49. Well, what's the square root of 49? The square root of 49 is 7. This would be my square root. That would be the answer. And believe it or not, every square root, if it's a positive underneath there, every square root has 2 answers. And the reason why it has 2 answers is because the square root of 49 is not 7, but it's also could be negative 7 because 7 times 7 is 49 and negative 7 times negative 7 is also 49. So many times your answer to your square roots can have 2 numbers. You cannot have a negative inside of a square root because there's no way that the same number can give you a negative answer, if that makes sense. Like, so if I had negative 49 underneath there, I can't have that because the same number times the same number cannot give me a negative 49. It'd have to be a 7 and a negative 7. So that does not work. So if there's a negative underneath the radical, it does not work. But this is different. This does work because you're going to find what the answer is to this, and then your number is, or your negative is going to fall underneath with it. So for example, if you have 36, negative radical 36, well, you know the square root of 36 is 6, and then your negative would come with it. So if it's on the outside, you can do it. If it's underneath, it cannot be done. So make sure you know that. And like I said before, you can use a plus or a minus symbol to indicate both square roots. So for example, if you would have, and it asks you what's the square root of 25, you have 2 answers. It can be 5 because 5 times 5 is 25, or it can be negative 5. Negative 5 times negative 5 is still 25. So you could write the answer like this, plus or minus 5. That tells me there's 2 answers to that square root. Okay, so each number has 2 square roots, like I said, a positive and a negative, and let's find these. So what's the square root of 100? There's 2 answers. Well, you know 10 times 10 is 100, and you can do it this way, 10 times 10, or you could do negative 10 times negative 10. So your answer could be plus or minus 10 for that. Okay, for 36, we kind of did this one already. It's going to be 6. It's going to be plus or minus 6. For 81, it'd be plus or minus 9. If you would have this, can this be done? This cannot be done because there's a negative underneath. The same number times the same number cannot give us negative 9. The only thing that can give us negative 9 is this, and this is not the same number. So that's why you cannot have a square root of negative 9. Now, if it looked like this, because first you're going to do this part, then this negative would come along for the ride. That's the only time you can have one answer is if it has that negative on the outside, because two positives cannot give you that. So if you have any questions about that, make sure you mark your notes. Here's an example of a story problem. Jamie has this garden that has an area of 144 feet square. She wants to put rock on each side of the garden, so she wants to put rock here, and she wants to put rock here, and all over here. Okay? How much rock does she need on one side and around the whole garden? Well, a lot of people would just say, if I take 144 divided by 2 or times 4, that's not going to work. That's what they would suggest to do. But to find area, you got to remember, to find area, you take the area of the base times the area of the height, and that's going to give you your square feet, okay, or your area. So something times something has to give me 144. Well, most likely if it's a square, it's going to have to be the same size of distance. It's going to be at the same distance. The base is going to have to be the same as the height, especially if it's a square, because the lengths of the sides are all the same. So to find this, instead of dividing by 2, see, if I would take 144 divided by, or 144 divided by 2, I get 72. Well, I know 72 times 72 is not going to give me 144. So that's why you can't divide by 2. So I would actually have to square root this to figure out what my two numbers are. That would give me 144. So it's not always feasible to divide by 2. It's not always going to work. So dividing by 2 is not going to give you a square root. So I need to know that. All right, so estimating the square root to the nearest whole number. So this is pretty simple. So I need you to think about this right now. I want you to think about this number, and I want you to think what perfect squares are around 35. What perfect squares are around these numbers? Okay, so if I look at 35, think of your list of perfect squares. 25 times 25, or I mean 5 times, we have 25 is a perfect square, 36 is a perfect square, 49 is a perfect square. This would be 5 times 5, this would be 6 times 6, this would be 7 times 7. So okay, look at 35. What's it going to fall closest to? We know that it's going to fall closest to this one. So roughly, the square root is going to be about, this is the sign for about, it's going to be about 6. So about 6 is going to be the square root of this. If you're estimating, we're going to estimate. We're not just finding what the square root is on our calculator. We're estimating what it is. So now if I look at 110, okay, we're going to think about 2. Okay, so what are my perfect squares around 110? Well, I know 100 is around 110. And 11, this is 10 times 10. And 121 would be 11 times 11. Let's see, this is 10 away. This is 11 away. Okay, so it's actually closest to this. So the square root of 110 is approximately, and I have a negative in front of that, being negative 10. So you have to think what it's closest to. So here's another example. Oops. What if I say the square root of 59? Okay, so think of your, and we're estimating. So think of your perfect squares around 59. So 7 times 7 is 49. I have 64. So 7 times 7. This is 8 times 8. So what's it closest to? This is 10 away. This is 5 away. If I'm thinking that right, yeah. So I know that this is closest to here. So I know the square root of 59 is roughly about 8. right, so the next thing we need to talk about is cube roots. Cube root is when you take 3 of the same number times each other. So square root is when you take 2, like when we had 7 times 7 is 49. This time we're going to take 3 numbers times each other, and that would be called a cube root. So it's when it's one of the 3 factors of the number. So the symbol is close to the same. It has the radical. The only difference is it has a little 3 up on top. So you might see, for example, 2 times 4 might look like this. Yep. So this would say, what's the cube root of 8? So you need to figure out to yourself, what are you going to times by itself 3 times to get you roughly 8? Now, a lot of times you can find this on your calculator. It's easiest to do cube roots on your calculator, but you can do the little ones, like what times what is what's going to give me 8. So then it's kind of a guessing game. 2 times 2 times 2, that's going to give me 8. 3 times 3 times 3, that's going to give me 27. So it's kind of just a guessing game. So the cube root of 8 is actually 2. The cube root of 8 is actually 2. All right, so a few things about cube roots. Cube roots are kind of its own deal. There's a lot of different things that go along with cube roots, even though it doesn't look like it should. So first of all, the cube root of a positive number is positive. Okay, the difference with a cube root and a square root, a cube root can have a negative number inside. Now I will show you why that can work. Number 2 is the cube root of 0 is always 0, which is kind of a given. And then this is what I was talking about before. The cube root of a negative number is negative. So if I say this, okay, so there's the same number that's going to give me negative 8. It'd be negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2, which would be negative 8. And it just works this way with cube roots because of your negative rules. If you take a negative times a negative, it's going to give you a positive. But if you're going to multiply 3 negatives together, it's going to give you a negative. So cube roots can have a negative inside the radical. Square roots cannot. Cube roots can. And that's what this means. Okay, so I just did that one up on top. Let's do this one down below. And I kind of did this one for you too. So I know that something times something, if something is going to give me negative 27. Oops. Something times something times something is going to give me negative 27. So I know it's going to be a negative number because if it wasn't negative, it's got to have some kind of negative in there. And I know it's actually negative 3, negative 3, negative 3. So the cube root of negative 27 is negative 3. Now, like I said, not everything is going to turn out to be a whole number because, you know, the only ones that are going to have perfect squares and perfect cubes are going to be the perfect whole numbers. So, like, the only ones that are going to have perfect whole numbers as square roots are the perfect squares. Anything else, like, and most likely that's everything else, like the square root of 10 isn't going to be a whole number. The square root of 12 isn't going to be a whole number. So there's a lot of square roots out there that are decimals that go on forever. But there's only very few that have whole numbers as squares. So that's kind of hard to remember. It's kind of hard to wrap your mind around. So estimate the square root. Here we go. We're going to do this again. We're going to estimate. So I just got to think to yourself, well, I know 3 times 3 times 3 is 27. 4 times 4 times 4, I believe, is 64. 5 times 5 times 5, I believe, is 125. Just from thinking about and knowing these things, you just kind of get in the hang of it. 6 times 6 times 6, I think, is 216. And you just start to learn them. That's pretty much all I know. I guess I don't know 7 times 7 times 7, but using what I know, I can kind of estimate already. So I know the cube root of 124 is approximately 5 because of this. All right, so if you have any questions, let me know. But otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks for watching.